Outside the ship, the Atra could be seen in her full glory. The warship was slightly larger than the Gabatrix. Even the Magellan-class battleships didn't meet the same size as the Itrean warships. The Tarintar vessel was like a giant alligator or crocodile that was exposing her side to the Gabatrix. The vectoring thrusters were bringing the ship closer and closer to the UHN ship. Carefully and slowly, the vessel came within 30 meters, having her bow pointed on the opposite side of the Gabatrix in perfect parallel. Both ships had their centripetal rings spinning. It almost looked like a duet in space. The Atra came to a complete stop and then began to extend a docking sleeve to connect to the docking hatch ring of the Gabatrix. Kane kept himself composed. This was it, a meeting with an alien race. He and the other guards would be the first to see them face to face and possibly live to tell the tale. The docking rings connected with little issues. Kane could hear a small thump sound as everything was in perfect sync. It surprisingly didn't take long. He could hear the sound of rushing air being pumped into the connecting hatches. Kane took long breaths as he kept his excitement down. God, they're probably going to be menacing, he said almost quietly to ensure the guards couldn't hear. He watched the purple-tinted windows of the hatch. The overhead sensors of the hatch began to activate. Initially, the sensor lights indicated a red light. It flipped to green and then had an additional light turn on. This light was depicting a second red light, but it was showing a progress bar. It must have been the way the ship notified crew members that the pathogen scanners were working. Eventually, that second red light switched to green. It was a sign that everything operated smoothly. The Tarintar were coming. They would arrive at any moment. Finally, the hatchway door opened with a slight whoosh sound. Kane kept composed, but his heart was beating fast. He held a firm stance. Sergeant Dasyuk had assumed a forward side stance. His machine gun was pointed down and away from the door to assume a non-hostile stance, while keeping himself ready. If the Tarintar meant to board the Gabatrix and assault the ship, they would be met with a hail of the finest UHN weaponry available. However, that was not what appeared. 3 of them came walking through the extended passageway of the linked ships. The 2 that came forward were surprisingly short in size. Kane was marking everything that he saw. The Tarintar appeared to look like small people that stood at about 4 feet in height. They walked in brown and green armor. He could see much of their faces and noticed that they walked in a ceremonial stance. They had tails that swung back and forth. Their boots appeared to connect to digitigrade legs. They made small taps on the deck as they walked in the zero-G environment, moving in step with each other as they carried an assault rifle of their own. These rifles were long with scopes attached to them. The magazines of these rifles were huge. The guns even had 2 barrels to them. For people of their sizes, they looked like they could carry a lot. Their helmets made it challenging to identify them. They had a small visor at the area where the eyes should be located. With the armor in the way, it was hiding their appearance very well. They walked in perfect step till they reached the main deck of the Gabatrix. Then they turned and assumed a guard stance by the door. They held their rifles up towards the ceiling and at their chest as some form of honor guard. Before much could be said, Kane looked ahead at the 3rd person walking up. His eyes widened a little bit. He shifted his stance a little bit at what he saw. The Tarintar behind the 2 guards stepped forward. Kane noticed it was a she. The Tarintar, without their armor, appeared to be bipedal reptilians. This woman had yellow-greenish scales on her skin. She stood on digitigrade legs and walked on what looked like red wrappings for her feet. There were green scale patterns that dotted her frame. She wore what looked like a white shawl that connected to an orange skin-tight suit. The shawl was similar to a dress of some sort that was both tan and white in color. The zero-G environment did cause it to sway around a little bit, but it didn't get in her way. Kane could tell it was a female due to the breasts on her frame. Even these aliens must have had genders. In fact, he noticed that the guard's chest pieces also poked forward a little bit. It was possible that the guards were female under that armor. His eyes went back to the dressed Tirintar woman. She had a tail that swung around as she moved. Her white feathers lined the top of her head and worked down from her back to her tail. The feathers also poked from her arms, almost as if she looked like a bird in some ways. She didn't have a beak, though, per se. Instead, she had a nose, mouth, and jaw that poked from her face. She had reptilian-like yellow and black eyes. Kane even noticed that she wore a gold anklet on her right leg. On her right wrist was a gold bracelet, almost similar to his bracelet. Each hand and foot had 4 digits, fingers, and she had claws that extended from her fingers and toes. She looked like she could be menacing in a physical fight, even for her smaller size. Kane decided to break the ice first. On behalf of the people of the UWA, I welcome you to the UHN Gabatrix. It seemed tense at first, but promising. The finely dressed Tirintar woman walked up to the ambassador. She remained quiet but kept a neutral look at her reactions. She was definitely shorter than Kane. She would naturally tilt her head up to the side to look up at him rather than directly look up. Her eyes would blink a few times quickly, unlike Kane, who blinked routinely. Kane was doing his best to remain as collected as possible. Surprisingly, her shorter stature actually made the ambassador relax a little bit. He was expecting them to be much taller in person. Welcome to the Gabatrix, he tried to say again. My name is Kane. I am the elected representative from the UWA people. Kane addressed her again. Her eyes and face continued to look at him from the side. She was slowly looking at him as if to study him in some way. She remained quiet for a while. Instead, Kane simply watched her in turn. The man knew that first impressions were important. He was worried, but he felt that he should do the same thing most humans do when they meet each other. They should extend their hands in a handshake. Hopefully, that wouldn't appear as an attack of some sort. He lifted his hand up to her. She backed up a little at first, causing her feathers to lift up a little bit. She would begin to move her head around curiously, eyeing his hand and arm. Finally, she lowered her nose to sniff his hand before looking back at him. I assure you that I mean you no harm, he told her. Your captain, adjunct, appears to know English pretty well. Do you understand my language? She opened up her mouth slowly, her feathers lowered back down. I know your language, human named Kane, she said. Her voice was slightly light and faint. She had a similar accent that the adjunct had as well. She walked around him as he lowered his arm. She seemed to study him again in a very close manner, while producing a slight grin on her face and snout. The woman continued to eye him as she was now behind him. Her tail lightly brushed him. She was to his left and then walked back in front of him. Her back was to him, before she gave the nod to her guards. They then turned around and headed back into the Atra. Kane simply stood in silence while his own guards seemed to calm down a little bit as well. Perhaps that was a good sign. The Tirintar brought in armed personnel just to send them back to their ship. The alien woman, instead, turned around to look at Kane. There was a smile on her face. She kept her head tilted a little bit and looked into his eyes. Her smile was infectious to Kane. It made him smile in turn. He made sure not to expose his teeth, though. Displaying teeth in a smile might be considered a hostile or threatening action. She simply held that pose, looking at him. Her eyes would do the quick, rapid blinks before she stopped. She must have held this pose for 10 seconds. How are you, Kane? She asked him. That was such an odd question for a meeting like this. He was truthful to her, though. I'm well. You are much shorter than I expected. I apologize if that meant any offense. And you are much taller than I expected, she said as she made a series of clicking, on what sounded like a deep chirp sound.
I mean no offense to you.
None is taken. What is your name? She made a couple more clicks in her voice.
I make the rules to this meeting, she said in a friendly tone. Cain, the human, you represent your people. Do you consider yourself a prime example of the males?
What? Cain remarked. Yeah, I am.
You need to say that with courage, confidence. You represent your people. You are the prime of your species. Do you consider yourself the prime of your species?
Cain nodded. Yes.
Then I am welcome on board your ship. The Tarintar gives their hand in the first act of friendship to you, Cain, the human. My name is Ifra.
She lifted her right hand to him. Her head was no longer tilted, but looking firmly at him. Her body language showed the same playful side, but became more firm. Her grin ended as she displayed a look of seriousness. Cain reached out his hand to her. Their hands met as he felt the poke of her claws. They felt sharp, but they didn't pierce or slice his skin. His hands felt a warm, scaly-like hand. It was smooth to the touch. Even with the claws in the way, he shook her hand a little bit. Then, let this be the beginning of our diplomatic meetings, Cain said. The setting seemed calm. Both Cain and Ifra looked at each other and felt comfortable with their environment. The hatchway cameras would record this first contact to hopefully be put into the future history books to come, assuming that it continued to operate in this fashion.